Well, the release candidates for Kotlin 2.0 are coming along, and we're probably not too far off from an official 2.0 release. So in this video, I'm going to cover some of the important things that you need to know about this release, and then I'm also going to demonstrate a few of the things that I'm looking forward to in Kotlin 2.0. When we say Kotlin 2.0, we're really just referring to a version of Kotlin. So same as if we were to say Kotlin 1.8 or Kotlin 1.9. And like all versions of Kotlin, it would include updates to the compiler, to the standard library, to the tooling around it, and that kind of thing. But what makes Kotlin 2.0 especially exciting is that this is the version of Kotlin where the new front-end part of the compiler finally reaches its stable status. And this is where you might have heard the term K2. K2 is not just an abbreviation for Kotlin 2.0. K2 refers to a ground-up rewrite of the front-end part of the compiler, so let's see what that's all about. As you know, Kotlin code can be compiled to different targets. So JVM bytecode, JavaScript, native machine code, and WebAssembly is now also its own target. Now, some things within the compiler, like language syntax, are going to be the same regardless of which of these platforms you're targeting. Now, on the other hand, instructions about how to output the target code is obviously going to differ depending on which of the platforms you're targeting. So this means that the compiler has two big responsibilities. The first is to understand the Kotlin code that you've written, and the second is to use that understanding to generate the target code. The distinction between these two responsibilities creates sort of a natural boundary within the compiler. So much like client-server applications have a front end and a back end, the compiler also divides neatly into a front end and a back end. So our Kotlin source code files come in the front door of the compiler into the front end, and this part of the compiler is where the source code is converted from just text into a tree structure that the rest of the compiler can work with. And once it has that structure, it can make sure that there are no syntax errors. The front end also resolves names for variables, functions, and types. So if we had a more complex code example that refers to a variable named user, well, the front end part of the compiler is the part that figures out which thing named user you're talking about. So if you're referring to a global variable or a property of an object or a function parameter or a local variable, that kind of thing. Once the front end has created the tree structure and figured out what each part is referring to, it sends that along to the back half of the compiler, known as the backend. Now there's a different backend for each of the main targets, JVM, JavaScript, native, and WebAssembly, but they do share some code. The main responsibility of this part of the compiler is to generate the target code. So when we say K2, we're referring to that front-end part of the compiler, the rewrite that's happening for that front end. And Kotlin 2.0 is simply the version of Kotlin where that rewrite becomes stable. Now K2 is technically the new version of the front-end part of the compiler, but it's a mouthful to say the K2 front-end part of the compiler, so most of us just call it the K2 compiler. Just know that when we say that, we're not referring to the entire thing, we're just referring to that front-end part. Now, as it happens, the front-end part of the compiler is the same part that the IDE needs in order to provide helpful feedback to us while we're writing our code. So for example, I mentioned how the front end is responsible for ensuring that our code is syntactically correct. Well, the IDE also needs to know that so that it can tell us when the code we've written isn't valid Kotlin code. And similarly, if our code refers to a variable called user, but say there's no such variable named user that's visible at the scope, we need to know that. And the IDE needs to tell us about that. And if it does exist, we need to know what it refers to so that we can jump to its definition. So as you know, IntelliJ has a Kotlin plugin that provides all of the Kotlin functionality. And this is the thing that uses the front-end compiler to do syntax checking and name resolution. So again, the front-end part of the compiler isn't just useful for when you're building your project, but it's also helpful in the IDE while you're writing the code for it. Configuring your project to use Kotlin 2.0 is as easy as just setting the version number. So for me right now, release candidate 2 is the most recent version as of the date that I'm filming. So I'm going to set mine here to 2.0.0-RC2. And of course, we got to tell Gradle to load these changes. Now, the K2 version of the front end opened up opportunities to improve things like type inference and smartcasts. And this is all great news, but it does mean that if the version of the front-end compiler used by the IntelliJ Kotlin plugin is different from the version of Kotlin that you're using to actually build your project, then you can end up with false positives in the IDE. So in other words, IntelliJ would tell you that there's a problem with your code when actually you could build your code and everything would work just fine. So if you set your project to use Kotlin 2.0, you should also consider setting the IDE's Kotlin plugin settings to use the K2 compiler as well. That way you can avoid that disconnect. To tell the IDE to use the new K2 front end for its analysis, you can open up Settings, and under Languages and Frameworks, go to Kotlin, and hit this checkbox to enable K2 Kotlin mode. And then you'll need to give the IDE the old restart. Now keep in mind that this setting affects all of your projects, and so if you are bouncing back and forth between some projects that are Kotlin 1.9 and some projects that are Kotlin 2.0, you could end up with some issues there. If you want, what you could do is what I've done here. I've just installed IntelliJ twice with 2 different versions and enabled K2 mode just for one of those installations. Now, even though the K2 compiler is approaching stable status, K2 mode in the IDE is still in alpha. And the biggest missing feature that I've noticed so far is Kotlin scripting. That means that if you're using Kotlin for your Gradle build scripts, you're going to have to get along without any help from the IDE for now. So as we've seen, the biggest change in Kotlin 2.0 is the rewrite of the front-end part of the compiler. Now this means there aren't going to be many major language features in this release, but K2 itself does bring along some performance benefits due to the data structure that it's using to represent your code now compared to the old way. I'm not going to detail those changes in this video, but you can expect to see some benefits both when you're writing your code and also when you're building your project. JetBrains recently reported about their findings of the performance improvements in an article, and I'll include a link to that article in the description. Now, as usual with performance, your mileage may vary, right? Because a lot depends on your particular code base. If you're interested in finding out what kinds of performance benefits you can expect to see for your own projects, you can use the K2 Performance Metrics tool, which will run benchmarks on your project using both Kotlin 1.9 and Kotlin 2.0. Since the front-end part of the compiler is responsible for resolving the names of types and variables and functions, there are also some improvements in the area of type inference and smartcast that you'll see in Kotlin 2.0. For example, one thing you might have noticed in some of the recent videos that I published about variance and type projections is that an in projection has used the nullable any type in the out positions anywhere that the type parameter was used. And this was true even if the type parameter has an upper bound constraint like I've got here. And Kotlin developers would often ask, like, if we know what the upper bound is, why can't we just use that? Well, under the K2 compiler, this will now use the upper bound instead of any, which means that this code here is going to work just fine over here in Kotlin 2.0. A similar benefit can be found when we check to see if an object's type is one of multiple types, like I'm doing here in this when expression. Now, previously when doing this, the type of consumable here would not have been smartcast at all. Whereas with Kotlin 2.0, it'll be smartcast to the nearest type that they have in common. So in this example, it gets smartcast to beverage. And this also works with just a regular OR operator. So if we were to convert this when into an if and else, you can see it still works. But the when expression is a little easier to read, so I'm going to put that back. Smartcasts also get a little bit smarter when using inline functions. Here I've got a chain of phases where each phase instance has a reference to the next phase, much like a linked list would be. And the phases get executed in order. Each phase is going to log out how long it took because of the call to this inline function here. Under Kotlin 1, we're actually not able to smartcast to the non-nullable type here. And that's because we're also setting the value again inside the same inline block here. So if we comment this out, you can see it works. But with this line enabled, this breaks under Kotlin 1. This is another case that the K2 compiler addresses though, and you can see our smartcast over here in the Kotlin 2 project works just fine. So there's some great stuff to look forward to in Kotlin 2.0. We got the performance benefits both in the IDE and during our builds. We'll get lots of little improvements to smartcast and type inference and things like that. Now, in case you're ready to start using Kotlin 2.0 today, I'll include a link to JetBrains' official K2 migration guide in the description below. Once Kotlin 2.0 releases, I'm sure we'll start seeing more language features come along. And with KotlinConf just around the corner, I expect we'll hear a little bit more about what's in store after the 2.0 release. Like most of the Kotlin community, I'm really excited about the release of Kotlin 2.0 and about the acceleration of features that will come afterward. Of course, I'm planning to cover many of those features as they get released, and so if you'd like to be among the first to know about any new articles or videos or projects that I'm working on, you should join hundreds of other Kotlin developers who have signed up for my email newsletter, and you can do that at newsletter.typealias.com. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
You've read the chapters online, and now I'm proud to present the Lean-Puff edition of Kotlin, an illustrated guide. Take the book offline with you, mark it up in your favorite PDF software, and get early access to new chapters as they're written. You can pick up your copy today. Just go to book.typealias.com.